Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Today, Katie and I are going to be talking about some of the worst mistakes we have made as parents and how that is pretty discouraging to acknowledge and to realize in your own life. But at the same time, we need to learn from our lessons. So we're trying to do that. And we're going to share with you how we are implementing those lessons learned in our lives. If you enjoy this podcast, please take the time to leave a rating or a review on iTunes or on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you watch us on YouTube, if you could leave a rating or a review or subscribe to our channel, that is very helpful as well. With all that said, I think we're gonna get this thing going.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
So when Elisha brought up this podcast title, I was like, I don't think I want to talk about our worst parenting mistakes, because I do think that for whatever reason, like talking about mistakes in general, obviously there's some vulnerability there, but it's kind of like, okay, I don't know. I'm pretty comfortable sharing most mistakes, but when it comes to parenting, it just hits really close to home for some reason. I just feel like those are things that are I like genuine regrets I have, and our kids are very young still. Our oldest is only 7 years old, and so we have many years to go, many mistakes to make, and the Lord's faithful through that. But I feel like, I want to do right by our children. They're the biggest gift that the Lord's given to us. They're the biggest responsibility, and so when I feel like I haven't done right by them, it bumps me out. But like Elisha said, that is how we grow. It's by acknowledging things like this and being able to move forward.
Yeah, and it just goes to show the how making mistakes in this area, it hits differently. The implications are, I think, far more poignant. They're more, long. They don't have to be long lasting, but they're just far more dramatic, I guess, or substantial in your life. And so when I brought it up, it sounded like it was this daunting episode. And I was like, well, no, I'm talking like more recently, kind of like some wrong attitudes that we've had towards parenting. And of course, this has led to bad practices as well as obviously bad thinking, bad philosophy, bad attitudes towards anything leads to bad behavior towards those things at some point. And the reason I've been thinking a lot about it is because just a couple episodes ago, it was when we were talking about like what we want to see transpire over the next 8 years or something like that. And for whatever reason, you said something in regards to parenting about where our kids will be at in 8 years. And it was so, I don't know, it was moving to me. I was like, it sobered me up like in real time here on the podcast. We actually we finished the podcast. It was towards the end. We finished the podcast and then we talked about it for another few hours afterwards, where we were like, whoa, 8 years from now, our children will be obviously out of childhood and into their teens, young adult years. And what are we going to do with these next 8 years in regards to parenting? It really sobered us up.
Yeah, I think something that this whole conversation too, just in thinking about it, has really encouraged my heart in is this is my heart towards my children, right? Is to do right by them. It's Elisha's in my heart to honor the Lord and to honor our children and the way that we're raising them. And I really believe, I think the more and more I'm just seeing people go to therapy, honestly, and talk about like recreate their childhood in a negative light. And I'm not saying that, all our parents are flawed. They've all made mistakes, as all humans. But it kind of breaks my heart for parents that tried their very best and now their child's going back at 40 years old and is kind of writing in trauma into their lives, and by parents who are genuinely just doing their best. And I don't think we're meant to live our lives where, we're parenting a 4-year-old and then that 4-year-old adapts and gets better and has to live with their parents' mistakes. And then at 40 years old, with an adult perspective, goes back and revisits those experiences when they were 4 years old and their parents were in their early 20s and trying to figure it all out. Like, I think there's a blessing that God gives that children are young when we are young as parents, because we are trying to figure it out. And that is when children are very adaptable and moldable and flexible. And so he's not giving us 40-year-old kids when we're 20 years old, you know, to try to be criticized by. You do have that just unwavering love of a child and that affection that is undeserved, but is still given to you at those young years. And so I guess it really gives me a heart for my parents and the times that I've been critical of them and Elisha's parents. And you guys know we respect our parents so much, but it's still easy to go back, even in our perfect childhoods, you know, go back and say, oh, well, I wish this was done differently, or this affected me this way. And I guess that's partially what makes me nervous as a parent. Are, okay, we're doing our best here, but what if our child at, 40 or 45 comes back and is like, why'd you do this? Or doesn't come to us, just goes and tells other people about how they are messed up, by something we did. Anyways, it's made my heart sensitive towards my children. It's also made my heart sensitive towards parents who have they're like the next generation, the older generation, who have their children's best interest at heart and made decisions accordingly. And sometimes they were good, and sometimes they would probably go back and change things too. And anyway, so I think we need to have less critical hearts towards our parents in this whole parenting thing.
No doubt. I mean, it is crazy convicting every time I will hear kind of a pathetic sob story that, we've made this joke like, oh yeah, it took, we heard on this podcast together, like it took me like 28 years of therapy to realize my parents were gaslighting me when I was a kid or something like that. And you're kind of like, what
that I had
the
a traumatic childhood.
Yeah, a traumatic childhood. And it wasn't like physical abuse. It wasn't even emotional abuse.
Trauma.
It wasn't. Anyways, and yet that's a common tale this day and age. And I found it's funny because I went for way too long of a run this morning and it destroyed me. But something I was thinking about in the midst of it was how, it used to be, I think, something that used to be a lot more common in spiritual growth and then in conversion as well. So like being, regenerated, coming to faith in Christ, is that I think you would hear in people's testimonies a lot, this retrospective regret in regards to, oh my word, I held all these things against people and I need to go back and make amends. I see now the Lord's revealed to me how wrong I was, 7 years ago with my employer, or 12 years ago with my parents when I did this. Like the Lord brings that conviction of sin, and you're able to go retrospectively see like, oh my word, I was so out of line. That's always been a sign of spiritual growth, is when people have those kind of like retrospective convictions, and they're like, what was I thinking? And a lot of times we go back and make an apology, or we ask somebody for forgiveness for a way that we acted in the past. And now it's becoming totally the opposite and far more common. People think they're growing spiritually when they're able to look back and see how everybody else wronged them so much. And they're like, man, I've really been enlightened. Like as I'm growing in my faith, as I'm growing in my understanding, I'm realizing how, all along I was the victim. And that's becoming so common in Christian vernacular, and just it seems like the common experience. Anyways, I'm with you. It's when you see our heart, or when you know your heart towards parenting. I know my heart towards parenting, and I want what's best for my kids. And yet I feel so inadequate. I feel so young and inexperienced and immature and, lacking wisdom. And so it does break my heart to think 20 years down the road, my kids are coming to me and they're saying, why the heck did you do this? Or this messed me up, or why'd you lead me astray here? And it's easy as an adult, when you're going back and looking, you view your parents as you view them now, right? So if your parents are in their 50s or 60s, you like see how much they know in their wisdom, and then you impose that who they are now when they were like to when they were 22 or 23 or whatever, even 32, 33, and you're like, why did you do that? Like that was so thoughtless, and yet they were most likely working with the information that they had, right? And their intentions were the best towards you. And so anyways, again, just grace. When you see the grace God's given to us and how we've so aggressively wronged him in every area of our life, in our thoughts, in our actions, in our priorities, and like we've just been an enemy to God in everything that we've done. And yet while we were enemies, the Bible says, he died for us. And then he didn't just die for us, he actually took our sins in that death, right? Making us right. And so you're like, wow, his grace for me, that grace, undeserving. and then we turn around and then don't have any grace for people that have had influence in our life, like our parents or our grandparents, whoever, people beyond us in it. And that's why it is one of the most unchristian things to do, unbiblical things to do, immature things to do. And, anyways, anyways, that's not what I was going to talk about today. I want to talk about things
that's what I was going to talk about today. No, but I think something that I want to go, I think, I guess people that do take that full responsibility, I've seen have more joy, just like, and be able to point back, because you can point back and see what went well and how your parents did set you up or how they didn't. Mm-hmm. And I've seen that specifically with my mom and her family, because my mom growing up, she always just said like what her parents gave her, what opportunities were there, how she loved her childhood, and said all these things. And it's funny because in hearing some of my other aunts and uncles playbacks of those exact same experiences now as I've gotten older, it's interesting to see how they totally saw a situation in a totally different light. And my mom saw her childhood and what it gave her and what my parents were trying to give her, or her, my grandparents were trying to give her. Whereas maybe another sibling saw, oh, I got the short end of the stick here or whatever. Yeah. And so anyways, but I've just seen the joy and the freedom and the lack of bitterness my mom's been able to have because of that. And it hasn't been, I guess sometimes people think, or I hear like, it's like digging up grief is what heals. And sometimes just, it's not bad to sometimes not need to acknowledge that there were painful moments and see the blessing. I guess.
Yeah.
I do think I want to say two things before we move on, because I know we're just in the weeds here in my own weeds. Thanks for being gracious with me on my soapbox here. But I do think that, one, we need people to talk to in our lives about this. We were talking, I think this is why therapy is so popular right now, is we don't have people in our lives to be able to talk to about, maybe some hurt that we still have or something like that. We don't have the safety in our marriage or the vulnerability there. We don't have the safety in our church or our friendships there or in our family members. So I do think that building a community that is really healthy, that you are able to communicate with, is very, very important for humans and the health of us. And the second thing is, trauma and abuse is real. Obviously, I just think it kind of takes away from true trauma victims and true abuse victims when everyone starts going back and writing that into their history to say why they're incapable now in a certain area or have a deficiency now. Because if everyone was abused, then no one was, kind of. And I think that there are people that really need support and everyone's kind of sucking it away from the people who really need that intensive help. So anyways, I know that's not what today was about, but okay. So diving into our children.
Well, so since that episode that we did, a couple weeks ago, I pulled the parenting books out again. And that's even right there. That's a confession. The fact that I had almost like pressed pause or taken a break, or maybe even thought in a lot of ways that I had kind of graduated from a lot of these parenting books. That's a confession right there. That's a totally flawed mindset in regards to parenting, in regards to many areas of life, but parenting in particular, especially in these young years, is it needs to be a persistent pursuit of success, of excellence, of growth, of meeting their needs, it's dynamic, it's ever changing. And we talk about, people say all the time, like, you never read the same book twice, because even if you read it last year, you've changed so much. And so the way you're going to interact with it this year is going to be, you're going to get something different out of it. And I would say that that's like times 10 with parenting books, because of how quickly your children are developing and how changing and developing and growing, and how the tactics need to change, and how even like your philosophy, the way you applied it, last month or even last week, needs to be changed a little bit. And so in pulling these parenting books out again and incorporating that into my morning reading time has revealed so many of my recent shortcomings in parenting. And so we're not going to talk about like these big, at least I'm not, these big mistakes that I've made over my 8-year history or 7-year history of being a parent. I'm just talking about some recent flaws that I've now been revealed to me through these books, in my thinking and of course in my tactics as well. And so one that was just so obvious, and again, it's painfully obvious, but yet here we are, consistency. Okay. Like I'm reading these parenting books And all the examples they're giving and all the coaching they're giving me, it's like consistency. And I had fallen into this wrong thinking of like, consistency doesn't matter. I wouldn't articulate it, but how I was acting was consistency doesn't matter as long as like when you do follow up or when you do implement it, you do it really well. Right. And so like,
or make it a really big deal.
Make
Like
it
I'm
a
going to
really
make
big
this
deal.
a big deal so they know it's a big deal.
Exactly. Especially when it comes to discipline or like, punishment for certain things where you're like, man, like consistency doesn't matter because they're going to really regret it this time. These books break down like, man, if 9 out of 10 times, or yeah, even if like, so if 1 out of 10 times, like they get away with it, they get what they wanted, like they're going to play those odds forever. Like they're always going to play those odds. And then like, they'll just deal with mom losing it, dad losing it, freaking out, making a scene, like grounding them, not letting them go to the event. Like I'm going to put my foot down this time. And yet I had fallen into that in my behavior towards my kids where there was no predictability and consistency in what the standards were and me following up and keeping those standards. And the story after story that these books would give, I'm like, oh my word, that's me. That's me. I've done that. I've done it with that kid. I've done it with, with this kid. And anyway, so that was the first thing that stuck out to me was the need for consistency in parenting and having standards that you are consistent in, meaning you uphold them consistently.
Yeah, and I love that. It's instead of having a big deal every once in a while, having a consistent, small, quick response over and over and over and over in the long term is way more effectual. And in the short term, like when you're dealing with toddlers, you're talking 2 days of being consistent.
Yes.
When you're talking to an older child, like 6 or 7 years old, now you're dealing with like brain grooves, more emotions, more things at play here.
Meaning to kind of like get back on the right track.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It takes 2 days and you're back in a good rhythm with them and it's
with
established.
Toddlers, it's very much black and white, and it is very much behavioral training for the most part. And so in terms of, when people speak of having your child's heart, I think at that stage, it's just your child knowing that you love them, you giving them attention, and being present in the moment with them. And that's kind of having your child's heart. When you get to 6 and 7 and moving on, basically past like 4 or 5 years old, you're dealing more with, it's more layered emotionally, where you need to tell them in different ways that you care for them, that you value them, and you have to make sure that they aren't being disciplined and then going in the next room and just being like, like on the outside I'm sitting down, but on the inside I'm standing up. That can do way more harm than good.
Right.
And so making sure whenever you're leaving a setting where they are getting in trouble for something, there is that total restitution, and it doesn't come as quickly as a 2-year-old. A 2-year-old, that comes immediately, unless you're dealing with a very, 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 stubborn child, which happens.
Yes.
That restitution is just so quick.
We love live music in our home. I think you would love live music in your home if you don't already enjoy it in your home. And that's why we made Voperg Music Academy. Check out the coupon below and you get a special discount for being a listener of this podcast, and you can bring live music into your home. Piano, guitar, fiddle, mandolin, ukulele. If any of those instruments sound like fun to you to learn or to have your children learn, go check it out. And even in acknowledging, the dramatic difference in a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old was so sobering when I sat down with these parenting books, because some of them I hadn't read since, our oldest was maybe 4 years old or 5 years old. And now that he's 7, it's like it's a totally different ballgame. And then the ones that, were 1 or 2 and I was applying whatever, philosophies to that child, now they're in this next stage. And it's, like I said, it's like this isn't like you do your parenting boot camp and then you just move on and you get into your routine. I really want it to be a vigilant and consistent part of my life. Like other important things are, obviously our health, our time in God's word. We can date consistently in marriage. And when it comes to parenting, not only do I want to, obviously we practice parenting all the time. We're always parenting, right? So it's not like you're never like you take a day off from that. But I think I took days off of learning about parenting, of growing in my knowledge, and around parenting, and really yeah, just again, we know how we do that in other categories of life, right? Like I always in business, I remember when we were doing more social media stuff, Gary Vee was always talking about how, like your day trading attention, like that's what we're doing. It's like attention. It's a day trading game where like what's valuable that day, and you implement the tactics accordingly, and child training, I really feel like is that day in and day out, grab for or need to be in the moment. To where is the child at today? What are their needs? What are their shortcomings? How are they developing? And a lot of it is just straight up physiological. Obviously, they're growing mentally, they're growing emotionally, and you want to be in tune to those things. But as their bodies grow, and especially in those young years, we really are giving them the ability to have self-control over their bodily and fleshly desires that are not helpful and that are sinful, that are going to be harmful to them long term. And I think it was Douglas Wilson that talked about this. Like a child that's sinful when they're young, like it's like not that harmful to anyone, or even it doesn't seem like to themselves, and yet that is the time to start getting them giving them self-control, like helping them take control of their emotions, of their actions. Because if you start doing that when they're later, like the ramifications are far greater. It's the same thing when somebody's getting somebody pregnant out of wedlock, or they're losing their temper and getting into a fight, or they're when their lack of self-control over their fleshly desires send them to prison. Like you don't want to start the process then. Right. It's the same when they're a child. Like we are teaching them and training them how to not be servants to their fleshly desires. And so it's actually way easier when they're younger to do that.
Yeah. And it was really encouraging when Elisha brought this up to acknowledge that in some of our other kiddos, some of our younger children, because our olders, we really have two sets going on right now. I'd say we have one set that's in the 6 to 12, and we have our oldest 2 in that stage. And so that is they are in a stage right now, which, according to the 6 to 12 book, or what your children need when they're 6 to 12, they really desire to please you at that stage. You have a lot of rapport with your children at that stage. And I do feel like we did train them very well. They were our first 2. And so we were pouring tons of time and energy into that training process. And so I just really feel like in this season, it's a very sweet season where we're really able to reap a lot of relationship in this season, because we aren't dealing with a lot of negative emotions, I feel like we're able to help them process their emotions, but we aren't dealing with antagonism coming from them to us. And so that is a big blessing. Something I want to be careful with the children in this season is, like, I read that book, When Your Children Are 6 to 12. I always say the title wrong, but I said that I read that last with our son in mind. And I just have been thinking about it a lot recently with our daughter, actually, because she's just a whole different ball game. And it just dawned on me a couple weeks ago, like, oh, she's in that stage. Like, she's in that stage where her memory's like an elephant, and you promise something to her and she remembers 3 months later. Like you said, you were going to do this thing, where she's testing your love and devotion to her.
Your loyalty.
It's like, are you going to give me your attention now when I know you're busy? Now's when I'm going to ask for it, because I want to make sure that I get it now. Just to test, where does your devotion lie? And so I'm just reminded, like you said, reading those parenting books, it's a totally different thing that I'm thinking when I'm reading this book with Lucy in mind versus Leon. Thinking, wow, I don't want to overlook her needs. And in this season, I want to really, while it's a reaping season of the training we did from 1 to 5, I want it to also be a seeding season where we're sowing for the difficult years that they're going to go through, a lot of different changes in preteen and teen years, and just really dig our roots in deep together, have them be really intertwined. So it's a reaping and a sowing season for those kiddos. And then when, we have a almost year-old up to a 4-year-old, and I feel like especially the year-old and the 3-year-old, we are in the thick of just that I expect explicit obedience, no questions asked.
Yes.
And we got away from that.
Right.
With the consistency, we started treating them like they were
Right.
our older children, and starting to, negotiate, starting to explain why, starting to think, oh, well, that's a really good idea that they have. We'll change our stance on this expectation we have for them, and really letting these smart little kids manipulate us.
They were starting to run the show.
Yeah, starting to run the show. And they have sweet hearts. But we, like Elisha said, we're not being consistent with doing the things that we did with the older ones. And I would say the older three, really. It's just the younger two that are, one's just coming into the stage where Elisha and I are looking at each other like, are we already having to tell him no and draw a line here? And then the 3-year-old, it's little things like him getting up on the counter. Like he's never supposed to get up on the counter. But every once in a while, he seems to have a good reason for getting up on the counter, and I've let him do it. And then, like Elisha said, without that consistency, he just consistently starts getting up on the counter. And then eventually I discipline for it. And it's like, that is so wrong as a parent.
So unfair, honestly.
It is. It's so unfair.
Yeah, because like you said, it seems because of the kind of their nature, they've got this disposition that's really winsome. At least, it's really
Our
fun.
child's very charming.
Everybody loves their kiddo, obviously, their kiddos.
Well,
So like you said,
yeah,
when they
but
break these rules, the whole hey, you weren't supposed to get out of your bed, or you weren't supposed to get up on the counter, and then they've got this reason, or they've got this good-natured, oh, I was just, and you're kind of, well, you know what, okay, that's probably fine. We are just messing with their head of well, what is the standard? Because clearly they don't really mean it.
Well, like our son today, this is what I mean, he's winsome. He gets up on the counter, and the reason why he's not allowed up on the counter without asking is because there's a lot of hazardous stuff in the top cupboards, and he
the
likes
burners
to get
might
into
be
everything,
on.
right?
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff.
And so, so we made this rule, but I do like to have him up on the counter to help me cook. And so if he asks, he's allowed to get up on the counter. It just has to be with supervision. And so today, he climbs up on the counter, and I'm like, oh, you got up on the counter without asking Mama. And he goes, oh, I like to be with you, Mama. And it's like, what? You know what I mean? In the past, I would be like, oh, that is so sweet. It's okay. But that's not doing him any favors,
Right.
because he's growing up serving his flesh in this very practical way. Yes, the Lord saves our children, and he's going to have to save them over and over and over. They're going to start realizing that they're weak in their flesh no matter what.
Right.
But there is this element of character being built where he's developing a pattern of serving his flesh and doing whatever he wants. And like you said, it's way better and more harmless to just start training that out of him right now at 3
Yes.
instead of when he's 13 and 23,
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's dawned on me is I didn't see any attitude issues, I put air quotes, attitude issues with, for instance, our 3-year-old. And that might be a lot more, I guess, a good gauge for the older kids, right? Hey, you care a lot about their attitude. You care all the time. And you also always care about their obedience and things like that. But the difference is in that young age, it's okay, he's got a great attitude, but he is not learning to, like you said, have self-control, to say no to his flesh. All he's learning is whatever I want to do, my body wants to do, I get to go do that. I find a good reason for it. I can explain it away. And we are failing him as parents and not teaching him the reality that, hey, you can't just do something because you want to do something in the moment. There are guidelines here, and we are going to establish them. It's our job as parents to establish those, and then to teach you how to submit to those. And it's for your benefit. It's for your good. Because again, just the way these books have been speaking to me, I'm like, oh man, I see it. It's so clear now that it's not an attitude issue, but it's he's just getting up on the counter, but it's the same thing when it's it's just you go into sinful things when they're older, and it's the same. It's derived from the same thing. Just my body wants this. It sounds fun. I want to go do it. Right. And it's so what's the harm?
I think back to that movie, that was a real wake-up call movie for me. What is it? The river runs through it?
Oh, yes. That
a river
fly
runs
fishing.
through it?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a depressing movie. But one of the boys is very strong-willed and very winsome in the movie, and he grows up staying very winsome, but with these huge vices that were never trained out of him. And obviously, Christ is void in that movie, and so that's the number one issue. But you can see, depending on how a child with that personality is parented, they can end up in different paths. And this boy was just like so burdened by his vices all through adulthood because of the way he was given into as a child. And he was really winsome. It was never this like attitude thing. Like, you're very drawn to him throughout the whole movie, just thinking this guy's awesome. He loves his brother. He loves his parents. But who bears the brunt of the parents not doing the hard thing? Him.
Well, it ends up killing him, right? Doesn't he die?
Yeah.
Does he die? And
Plot
it's
twist.
like his vices killed him in the end. Even though he was winsome, he was fun loving, his parents loved him, his brother. And it's like they would be troubled to be like, oh, you came home late last night. Were you out drinking again? Where were you at? Oh, and he turns it into like, let me make you breakfast, like, don't worry. And you're like, oh, this is a great guy. He loves his parents. His parents feel loved. And you're like, oh man, that starts at such a young age. And in the movie, it starts at a young age too, where you just see that in his childhood, where he wasn't following anybody's rules. He was a slave to his flesh. He was a slave to eventually sin. And he found a way to make that. And it's, again, he's the one that had, I think of that with my kids. This isn't about us. This is about our children. What's best for them, which actually leads to my second point, because I feel like we would talk about that one for forever, the consistency point. But then the second one was parenting as before, parenting basically for optics, parenting for fear of man, parenting for how other people see me parenting, not for my child and not as before God. And really realizing that, like, wait a second, this is about my child, the Lord. Like, he has given me these children to steward their souls, their character, their emotional well-being, whatever, their attitudes, their physical capabilities, their physical development. And how am I stewarding that? And the way that this shows itself, at least in my own life, is doing, well, what's crazy is even doing things like this. It's acknowledging to other people, oh, I'm struggling with this. Like, I'm really working on this, so-and-so is really having attitude problems and we're working through it. But you're actually not even bringing that up to other people for your child. You're bringing it up to kind of cover your bases. Like, oh, everybody can see my child has attitude problems. They can see they're disobedient. And so I'm going to bring that up as a prayer request, or I'm going to bring that up at coffee to know that, like, yeah, they're really having attitude issues today. Because you have this fear of I hope they know that I know, right? Like, I hope they don't think that I'm this oblivious parent that just thinks the best of my kids. Because obviously that's another, pit to fall in, is always thinking your child's right. And so whenever you see that, you're like, well, I don't want to be that parent that's clearly oblivious to how sinful and naughty their child is. And so you go above and beyond, when you're around other parents, when you're around family members, whatever, when you're at church, when you're on a podcast talking about it, being like, oh, my kids, I'm really struggling in this area of my parenting. I'm dealing with these attitude issues, these obedience issues. And then realizing, like, I wasn't even doing that first and foremost for my child and as before God. I was like doing it to cover my basis as before man, which is crazy wrong, like so sinful, so disingenuous, like, and so, it's like ripping my kids off, like, and here's the thing, your kids know too, like, whether you're doing it for them or for fear of man. Yeah.
And like you're saying there, that exact same action could be stemming from an appropriate heart for looking for advice, for like, I'm at my wit's end. I really don't know what to do.
No doubt.
I really need prayer. And, I think those are beautiful things to do and to bring out public. That is what the body of Christ is for.
Right.
But that exact same action can be taken just to make yourself try to look better. Like almost everything we do, right, it could be done from an appropriate heart or from a heart that's trying to make ourselves look better. And the kids know the difference probably more than anyone else.
Yeah.
And that's really humbling, actually.
Yeah. And I think the things that I've said, and I'm just kicking myself, but it is what it is. I get to learn from this, is saying things about your child, like speaking into their identity, because like, and this it seems so innocent in the moment, but then I look back and I read these books and they just call me out on it so vividly, or I guess accurately. And that's like, oh yeah, he is really a twerp, or he's going through an awkward stage, or, we're really working on that rebellious attitude. You even saying this in front of your kids sometimes. And it's like, you're giving them language to their which is now becoming their identity. And you're thinking of them that way. It's like, they're a brat, they're, fill in the blank. And again, I'm not saying you're always overtly doing it for fear of man. Like, I think most people are seeking counsel, and when you're seeking prayer requests, requesting prayer or seeking counsel, obviously, like, most of the time, people's hearts are probably in the right place. I'm talking about from where my heart's been in some of these areas. And anyways, it's really unfair to the kid, because then they start living into that identity. And I see it happen in my children, and I'm sure it probably happens in other people's homes too, where you make this statement about your child as though it's fixed, as though it just is. And in a lot of ways, it's like, hey, like, figure that out with your kid and with God. Like, don't be talking to everybody about that. Like, don't put that title out there for your child. And then because I think they'll live into it.
Yeah, this is something that we've been convicted by multiple times. Even something so simple as reading, I read the Birth Order book, and I think it's a great book. But I started saying things about certain children that we had, maybe tendencies or traits of where they were at in the birth order, and seeing those, and then just starting to kind of speak them into that child's identity. And Elisha, I've mentioned this before, but I think it was so good that he stopped me. It was like, Katie, we aren't going to parent from this place of assuming this child has this tendency. It can be helpful to understand what pitfalls could potentially turn up, but we need to just parent with each child as this individual that we're kind of coming to with this open heart and open mind, going, okay, how can we teach them about the Lord? What areas in their character do they need to grow in? What gaps are there that we need to help with? How do we need to show them that they're loved? How do we need to work on these behavioral issues? But go to each child without a filter, maybe saying, well, this child is this way, and therefore I am going to parent this way, because those gradually slide in to our parenting in terms of, like, we mention our winsome 3-year-old currently, that's got a little sparkle in his eye, to be a little deviant. But we don't want that to become his identity in saying, oh, this is who he is, this is who he is, this is who he is. Or if a child maybe is going through a whining season, we don't be like, oh, well, that's our whiny child. It's just kind of like, no, that's not a whiny child. This child has whininess. All children have whininess. We're going to train that out of him and seek the Lord for guidance on how to do that.
Yes.
Same with, okay, deviance. Okay, well, this child shows a lot of deviance at this stage, but deviance, foolishness is bound in the heart of every single one of our children. So how are we going to address this in this child right now? Instead of saying that is who this child is, realizing that all these weaknesses, all these sin issues, we all deal with as humans to different levels, and they can all be addressed by the power of the Holy Spirit. And we don't need to kind of say, okay, this is your weakness and this is your strength.
Right. Yeah, it can go. Yeah, they're the lazy one, and a lot of times you'll do it because it starts with almost like this positive, like, oh, I love how you take one kid takes the initiative, and then you start realizing, like, oh, well, they're the introvert, they're the shy one, and it just keeps going and going and going. And I don't know if we just I don't know how that's helpful in our own mind. We're like this, we're just categorizing them, but I don't think it's helpful to the child and to their development. Anyways, yeah, so that was an area. I'm going to keep moving just because I want to get through a few of these.
Yeah, you go. I love it.
Another thing is just touching on that real quickly. Yeah, I said this is just the mindset, like, oh, my kid wouldn't do that, right? Like, my child wouldn't do that. It's happened way sooner than I anticipated. I think that, like, in theory, I understood that verse, like, foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. And I think I understood and believed in theory that, like, when kids get together, there's this mob mentality, and even my kid will end up doing something or saying something that I would have never expected him to do or say. And I believed that, but then I didn't really believe it though. Right. And so, or maybe I thought it would happen when they're older, like they're in their, their adolescent years, and they go along with something a little too far, or they say something that they knew they shouldn't have said. And this, totally a good learning moment. A really good friend called and just reported something that he had heard about one of our children saying. And it's funny because even in the moment, and he was obviously really great. She's like, this might not have even happened, but just so you know that this is what I heard happened. And it's funny because I didn't, even though I took it, I was just kind of like, oh man, thank you so much. I'll follow up on that. I didn't really actually believe that it had happened that way.
Yeah,
right?
You're like the other kid, I'm sure.
Like I think this is all kind of fabricated a little bit. This is probably made up. And it's funny because I almost I didn't. I kind of forgot about it honestly for a few days, and then I was with this child in our home that this is reported about, and I was able to address it. And sure enough, I got a confession. No, it was like, oh, straight up, it wasn't hard to get the confession. They were like, yeah, like that's exactly what I did. That's exact. And I'm like, whoa. Like I had just assumed you to be so far above that, so beyond uttering those words or letting that proceed from your lips. And again, it was humbling and really sobering because it's like, oh, that's right. That's our children. Like and our children in the four walls of our home, they know the boundaries, they know the standards. I think they are like great kids to be. I still think my kids are awesome, right? I love being with them, but they are also prone to behaving in ways that are totally inappropriate and that are extremely naughty. Or this is the other thing too, is I would oftentimes blame other kids for being the instigators. It's like, well, my kids, maybe they participated, but it would never be their idea, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're just kind of going along with the flow and just letting my kids off the hook. But it's like, well, no, like I need to be training my children for these moments, knowing that they, when they're with a group of people, might be the one coming up with the bad idea, right? Might be coming up with the naughty things to talk about. So anyways, that was a humbling moment to realize like, oh, all those things that I thought, of course my kid wouldn't, right? Like then boom, perfect scenario and it's just starting, where it's like, again, I don't want to assume my kids are going to be doing all these crazy naughty things, but I do know that they are human children that are capable of doing all these naughty things. And I need to be training and prepared for that.
Yeah. And I don't think it's just starting, in my, perspective. Hopefully this is something that is actually ending as we're coming into, I really love that perspective that Douglas Wilson shares, that short leash when they're younger and the long leash when they're older. And really, we've kind of let out the leash a little bit. And now our children are navigating social scenarios, not like the 2-year-old that's like 100% always with mommy. And so they're making some mistakes there. And I feel like it is, hopefully we're able to train with this really short, quick leash here. And so, in a year or two, they are able and capable of going in situations and being the leader.
Yes.
And, because we have, you say that. And then on the flip side, we have been really grateful where we've heard reports where someone said, oh, these kids were talking about this. I overheard them. And I heard your son say, we aren't going to talk about that and gather his siblings and go take them somewhere else.
Right.
And just like, wow, that's so cool. So I do think that there's this, I remember that phone call and it shocked me so much. I was like, that did not happen. But I do think there can be an assumption that our kids are going to do. We can fall into the hole of thinking, that our kids would never do that.
You're right. And I shouldn't say this is just getting started.
It's I don't think that's,
That's good. I'm glad you said that because one, we actually have really positive evidence as well from situations, which I'm bringing up negative things because they were lessons learned for me where which is important. Yeah. But I mean, again, I'm the biggest fan of my kids. And so far I'm like really happy with their character, their attitudes, and so we've heard some good reports, but obviously there's, lots of work to be done, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And we don't want to always have that parenting perspective of, well, our child's always perfect
Yes.
because they're our child. So clearly we've taught them the right thing to do. And
or I've
how
never seen
dare
them
you assume wrong.
Yes, I've never heard them say that in my house. Of course, they didn't say it. Or I've never seen them do it at my house. They wouldn't do that. And then going to beyond to like, oh, maybe they were influenced into it. Yes, that's happened. Oh, maybe it actually was even their idea. All those things.
And in the long run, I guess the win in that, accepting responsibility for our child and what they're doing, enables us to correct that behavior. Because if we're always making excuses for our children, then they don't assume responsibility when we aren't willing to assume responsibility. And
absolutely,
let them assume that.
That's exactly right. You get to address it. You get to it's a training moment, and you get to teach them how to take responsibility for doing the wrong thing, which is a lifelong thing that you need to have practiced, and hopefully it's a lifelong skill. Actually, is really what it is. It's a character thing, but I do think there is a skill in learning to take responsibility for things and growing from that. All right, the one last thing that I wrote down in regards to some recent mistakes, and that is the age-old, I guess, pitfall that parents find themselves making, find themselves doing. What do you do with pitfalls?
Falling
into them? Yeah. Fall into this. Yeah, anyways, pit. I've been falling into the pit of letting outside stresses, outside pressures, or even just personal issues and pressures then creep into my parenting, creep into my the dynamic I have with my child. It is such a cool opportunity to think about being the I think, it's easy to picture like, oh, we're going to protect our children from the physical dangers of the world. So we're going to not let them get hurt physically, and we're going to protect them physically. But then we will like be thoughtless about how like emotionally, if we're up and down and we're struggling with things, we let that carry right into our parenting, or we're stressed, and there's a lot of weighing on our minds, and just mentally we're drained with work or with outside, financial pressures, whatever. And then all of a sudden that creeps into the home. And, once again, just like, I'm reading these books and I'm like, man, this happened to me last week, where I'm sitting down at a meal with my kids. I get a phone call which these phone calls are going to happen. I think our entire life, where it's suboptimal news. And I don't care what stage of life you're in, suboptimal news or bad news is always going to be bad news, right? And so when you're newlywed, like the bad news might be that like the garbage disposal's broken and it's going to cost you like $75 or $150 to fix. And you're like, oh my, that's the worst. But then those phone calls keep coming, throughout life, where there's that bad news. And I full on let that sour my mood. I had a chip on my shoulder towards my kids. And it's like, this is not on them. That is my responsibility as the father. And it's a privilege as well. It's a crazy privilege to like be that barrier, that bulwark that's like, no, you're a child. Like you don't carry this burden, this stress, these pressures. That is my responsibility. It's my privilege. It's an honor to be able to like be this blockade from all these outside stresses and pressures that are financial, that are physical, that are, spiritual, that are emotional. And you get to be a child and to develop within that safety and security. And it's my job at the dinner table, when we're sitting down, to be fully engaged with you, to make you like, what does my child need? What are they interested in right now? Right? Like whatever the phone call was at that moment, it's like, that's not on them at all. And so I'm not going to make them pay for it. Even if it wasn't my fault, right? Like, it's like, it could be because, and this probably was my fault, but it's like, even if it's an outside thing that you're out of control of and you feel like you're a victim, it's like, well, don't make your child now a victim because you feel like whatever, something didn't go your way. Anyways, that's just become so apparent to me, where it's like, man, I want there to be such a clear buffer that they are in, right? And we're not lying to them. We're not, deceiving them and saying things are better than they really are at any point in life. It's like, no, they're not carrying the stress of it. They're not carrying the pressure of it, the responsibility, the weight of it, right? When we're not. So anyways, that was another area.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned this area. I think this area is where my biggest mistakes in parenting stem from.
Wow.
Is my reactions, and I say reaction because that's what it is, instead of like a response to my children when I get hit out of the blue by stress. And I do this with you too. And it's been, recently I've been very guilty of that sin in my life of taking out, stress that I feel internally just at people around me that have nothing to do with it. Or, it's not their problem. They didn't do it. And so I just think that is something that, I'm not actually going to talk on a lot right now because it's actually something I feel like really strongly about. I guess I feel like really guilty about, in this current season of life is just like letting stress that I'm feeling about certain things impact, me doing math with the kids, or when they want to point something out on a car ride and I snap at them because I'm stressed about what you and I are talking about, and it's just like, I don't want my kids to grow up thinking, was mommy okay to talk to right now or no? And
you're way hard on yourself because you are. Like you can probably count 2 instances over the last, month, and that's what you're thinking about now. And it is cool that you want to grow through those instances, and not repeat them. But I think you do a phenomenal job of making our home a place that is fun, like learning's fun, meals are fun. Every part of the day is fun, honestly, with you. And you create that, you do create that culture and that, attitude, in that environment in our home, regardless of the outside circumstances. And it's like, we're making it sound like, what are you guys talking about? Outside circumstances? It's like, well, like, are you guys going bankrupt, or are you guys being sued, or we're not like fighting cancer or anything like that in our lives. Nothing. Our lives are awesome. And that's the irony of it. Like, that's the frustration, is that we're in an amazing season of life, and yet there's still pressures, because that's just how life works. There's still going to be outside stresses and pressures. And so I want to not let my children feel those outside stresses and pressures at any point, whether they're real and meaning like dramatic and, something that people, write books about, or if they're just like everyday stresses that every human being has. I don't want my children to pay for those things, right? Like, it's not their time right now. And again, this is different from like lying to them or saying like, oh no, we're rich when you're, about to lose your house. You're like, I'm not saying I'm lying to them about anything. It's just like not letting them be responsible or take the blame or take the hit for it, emotionally. And I don't think at all you create such an amazing environment in our home, and you parent from such a place of, grace towards our kids and towards me. So if you feel any like you've fallen short, it's like twice, because I can remember them this month too. So that's why I know it's 2 times.
It's like, because it hasn't been, you aren't completely innocent. No, I do think that this is an area that Elisha does really well in, actually, and I really want to grow in. It's like with me, with the kids, like your patience and your even keelness, really inspires me, and your lack of emotion when stuff hits, and like your ability to get quiet when you are stressed is a real skill set. I really admire the way you just like, Elisha's like a stress absorber. He just like internalizes it. It's like, I'm going to deal with it. And it's a valuable skill in raising a family.
I've had a very stress-free life, honestly. And so, I can't really speak to that issue.
Yeah, and we don't want you guys, this isn't like, oh, things are so hard. You guys know we've just been in a complicated season for a while now, maybe a few months, where it's just a lot of things happening at one time logistically. And so that just leads to more stress trying to make everything line up. And we will be telling you guys more about what's going on in our lives too, as we continue going. But right now, we just are kind of enjoying trying to figure out our own ball of yarn over here, without sharing real time everything that's going on. Yeah. But it's not like I'm going to throw a third leg or something. No. We aren't going to reveal any third legs, third arms.
Don't get your hopes up here. Okay.
But we aren't going to be as vague as maybe we've been for like a few months.
Yes.
We can be more like, okay, this is what happened, or this is what we've been working on for the last few months, or whatever, moving forward. But we've just found it's been healthier for our family when we just, try to figure out our own stuff.
Yeah.
Before we talk a lot about it.
Well, that's what I had. We can probably wrap this up. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just so thankful that the Lord is gracious and the Lord is sovereign. And I don't say that as this excuse to abdicate responsibility, but it does bring me a lot of peace. And I do feel like I'm really convicted in seeking the Lord, because I do think that's a big mistake we can make as parents. You were talking about that to me, just like not seeking the Lord is one of the biggest mistakes we can make as parents, because that is where we fall short, is when we go at this thing without his wisdom and support and insight, and he is their father. And so without him, our parenting is like a bunch of stubble. Yeah. And so that is, I am convicted in that.
Yes, I forgot that was like a sub point. I should have brought that up, but it's like we are failing our children when we are not growing spiritually, when we are not growing in our knowledge of the Lord. You know, we talk about bringing up our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. It's like, are we bringing ourselves up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? Are we training ourselves in his precepts and in his ways? And because that's, we're failing our children. Obviously we're failing ourselves, but we're failing our children too. We're failing our spouse if we are not doing that.
Yeah. And how can we hope to trust our instincts or our intuition or like any of these things if we're just so detached and growing so stale and cold to our Creator?
Yes.
It's like I don't trust that at all.
Yes.
Is going to bring forth the fruit that we hope to one day see in our children.
Amen.
So, anyways, but blessings on all you guys as you raise your children. There's just so many wonderful families out there and that listen to this show. And the more we get to meet you guys and hear from you, it just really blows me away. And it makes me so excited for the future of my children. It makes me so excited, that they're going to have spouses out there. So that's a blessing. And it's just for the future of the world as a whole. I just think there are a lot of parents that are being so intentional and seeking the Lord and loving each other. And I just pray that the Lord continues to give you guys wisdom on this journey alongside of us.
Yes. Amen. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.